Forward with Truth.
Welcome back to Forward with Truth. We're great to it's really great to have my good friend Dr Crawford Gribben from Queen's University, Belfast. Dr Gribben has been an academic for quite a few years, and he's published quite a few books. But today we're looking at these two books, and by the way, this is not a paid promotion, but these are the things that we're looking at. This one here is his most recent book, The Rise and Fall of Christian Ireland, and this one here is an earlier one, which is Survival Resistance in Evangelical America. So Dr Gribben has explored. He's the author of many other important books as well. Landmark studies in the Puritans, particularly John Owen, and also more recently Mr. Darby as well. So there's a lot of work that. But today's episode we're going to begin by exploring the roots of Christianity in Ireland, its historical formation, cultural influences, and the forces that led to its rapid decline. We're going to examine how secularism has reshaped the Irish religious landscape and ask what the future may look like in the church here. From there we'll turn to Dr Gribben's research on evangelicalism in America, and we'll look at how secularism has led many different responses to evangelical resistance. So Revivalism, the religious right, and Reconstructionism. Now whether we're going to get through that in an hour, I'm not sure, but we're going to do our best. So that's sort of what we're looking at. Great to have you.
Thanks, Nathan. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
And it's good to have a sunny day.
Yeah. And I did pay you to advertise those books.
Don't be saying that now. But here, so the origins. So let's just begin. We live in Ireland, Northern Ireland, but we live on the island of Ireland, and it has nearly 1,600 years of Christian influence. Maybe it's slightly more if you think about the slaves and all that were captured and taken over. But in your book on Christianity in Ireland, you trace its development from the very first beginning. Can you give us an overview of how Christianity first took root here?
It's a really hard question to answer because we actually don't know. Yeah. So the first date that we have in Irish history, the first secure date for an event is 431, when the Pope sends across Palladius from Gaul to be a bishop of the Christians who are already living in Ireland. Yeah. But we don't know who they were, we don't know how they got here, don't really know anything about them. But we know they're here and they need some kind of pastoral oversight, and Palladius comes across to look after them. Now, Palladius' name is not very familiar to us. No. We're more likely to have heard of Patrick, and one of the reasons for that, I think, is because the Patrick myth really develops fast and over quite a broad region. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the stories that may be actually Palladius stories become attributed to Patrick and help to build up the mythology around the more famous of the two founders, really, of the Irish Church. But Patrick comes across probably fairly quickly after. Mm-hmm. Palladius, of course, he'd been here before as a slave, and it's during his time as a slave, almost certainly in Slemish, no matter what the Mayo tourist office might say.
Oh, I tell you.
Almost certainly in Slemish. It's during that time that he becomes a Christian.
Yes.
And he writes about it very movingly in his confession, his Confessio. We don't really know where they come from. Maybe there's more people like Patrick. I guess there probably were. Yeah. But really it's in 431 that the church begins to say, we've got responsibility for people in Ireland, let's go and do something with them.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things, isn't it? Every church wanted to have a link to Patrick. It's sort of, it helps you build up your fan base, as it were, to say, oh, well, we stretch back to Patrick or one of Patrick's early disciples.
Right.
So it makes sense, but there is a lot of evidence of Patrick certainly in the northwest of Ireland, but whether or not he got down to Mayo, we can only guess,
Yep. So there's some references in his writing to the Western Sea.
Okay.
That's probably Lough Neagh.
Yeah. Well, you never know. So, but many associate Irish Christianity primarily with, Roman Catholicism historically, but there were also strong Celtic and later Reformed Protestant influences, how do these different traditions help shape the Irish religious identity?
Yeah, good. I think we need to be a bit cautious about the term Celtic.
Yeah.
Because no one until the 17th century would have called themselves a Celt. Yes. So I think we need to be just a little bit suspicious of that language.
Be more Scots, wouldn't it?
Well, the Irish Church was Irish before it was anything else. The question was, through its early centuries, what was its relationship to Rome going to be? And obviously we talked about Patrick, but Patrick is followed by other early saints like Columba or Bridget, and each of those three major figures becomes the focus of a network of monastic institutions which begin to spread through the island and then beyond. Mm-hmm. And each of those monastic institutions, or federations if you like, has a slightly different relationship to Rome, which we can begin to calculate, for example, when we think about the different attitudes they took to the question of the dating of Easter. Mm-hmm. So today we're familiar, I suppose, with the idea that the Eastern and Western Christian churches tend to have different ways of calculating those dates. Well, in Ireland for maybe the best part of a century and a half, different federations calculated those dates independently of each other. And so there was two Easters often celebrated on the island, depending which federation you were linked to. So those are they are Celtic in so far as they are churches, or a church, the Irish Church, staffed by people who live in this island in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century. But I think we need to be careful with the language, because there's a kind of a mini industry now promoting a concept of Celtic spirituality. Yeah. And sometimes you hear people talking about it. It's much more nature-based, much less dogmatic, friendlier towards the participation of women, etc., etc., etc. And I think really there's not a lot of historical basis for a lot of those claims. It's really more a reflection of trends within New Age spirituality, for example, or some kind of response to ecological concern or environmental disaster. So Celtic, a little bit cautious of that. Certainly Irish. Yeah. So it's Irish, and then gradually it becomes Catholic. It's always notionally Catholic. Whenever Patrick writes his statement of faith, a description of his own faith, it's essentially the Second Nicene Creed, but he adds a little bit at the end of it, speaking about the imminence of the return of Jesus, which is really interesting and tells us a lot about his sense that he has reached the end of the world, not just geographically when he comes to Ireland, the last known territory to be inhabited as far as he's concerned, but also the end of time itself. So there are some very distinctive features then with this. Really it's about the 12th, 13th century that the Irish Church begins to get pulled much more closely towards European norms, and we see that, for example, when St Malachy comes back, turns out to be a friend of Bernard of Clairvaux, and brings in the Cistercian order and so on, new architecture, new ways of thinking about lots of things. English intervention in Ireland during that period is warranted on the basis that somebody needs to come to sort out the Irish Church. Yes. To guarantee this Catholic Reformation. And so Henry II is really essentially invited to come and sort things out, or given that responsibility again by the Pope Adrian. And then, of course, we come to the second of the two Reformations of the Irish Church, which is the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And of course, this is where we do, of course, Loudbiter and all gets brought in that first one, doesn't it? That's right. And we're having a situation where a lot of Irish clerics are forbidden to be clerics in Ireland. Yeah. Now, at least for a time, we don't know for how long, but certainly there was some of that. Yeah. But really it's only in the Protestant Reformation that the Irish Church becomes Catholic. Really? Because it's really only up until really the 16th century that Irish churches got married clergy, for example. There's one famous Catholic clergyman during the 16th century is called the Purple Dove of Chastity. Yes. So he's reputed for his piety. He's got 14 children. but legitimate children. So there's a strange paradox, really. There's a Catholic Reformation that fails. There's a Protestant Reformation that fails. The Irish Church has really always done things its own way, and it's always negotiated these external influences, even as it's reflected in its own understanding of itself. So we don't like change. Or other people telling us what to do. Oh, no, surely not. Yeah. No, that's interesting, because I think very often we,
and I've done more study, admittedly, in the sort of earlier periods rather than Middle Ages and sort of Reformation period. I haven't researched as much, but it's interesting that at that later date, there's a huge influence then of people who are still marrying. The clerics are still marrying, and certainly the influence of monasticism up until 1000 is really, really big in Ireland. What drew you to write the book?
Well, living here and having been living here, I suppose, fairly consistently since the mid-90s.
Yeah.
With some gaps, but fairly consistently. I suppose I became aware that I was living through a time of really significant change. Mm-hmm. And then, as the father of 4 children, I wanted to be able to explain to my children what had happened, where we were now, and also to think what the future might begin to look like. Yeah. So I wanted to, to spend some time then just reading around this subject and trying to pull it all together. There's not very much original in the book apart from its mistakes, so it's mostly trying to synthesise what other people have done. Yeah. So there's lots of histories of the Catholic Church or Presbyterianism or this or that denomination, but there are very few books. In fact, I can really only think of one other book that tries to tell the story of Christianity or the Church in the broadest sense on this island, and so that was something that I wanted to do. It's very easy to pick and choose as an historian what it is you identify with or want to write about, but it's a bit more challenging to think about, to think about your preferred identity, let's say, in a much more historical way, or an historically responsible way. And of course that takes you far beyond your usual stomping grounds, let's say, as you begin to think about what's essentially your family history. Yeah.
And, like all families as well, there's cousins you forget about. Yeah. And you find, they're part of the family too. Yeah. So what would you say is the most common misconceptions, especially from outsiders, about Irish Christianity? And this is important because, as you'd mentioned, very often outsiders want to influence Irish Christianity.
I think there's a tendency, I think, for people to assume that Irish Christianity is Catholic. Of course, it has been built into nationalist narratives of identity that's a given. And to be Catholic is to attend Mass every Sunday and so on and so on. And yet, once we begin to look at even the history of Catholicism in Ireland, we begin to see that weekly Mass attendance is a relatively recent phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Really only coming up in the mid-19th century. Until then, there's quite different ways of thinking about piety or even family piety or parish piety, parish worship. So I think there's a number of key things like that. The story of Christianity in Ireland is always much more varied than we expect. Like any other religious movement, it's constantly changing, constantly adapting to its environment. Sometimes it's being led by people who are principled and thoughtful about what they want to be and do. At other times, maybe it's being pushed around a little bit by the culture and maybe losing its sense of its own identity or its responsibility to be itself. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you look at the history of the Church over 1,500 years or more, the challenge has always been for the Church to be itself. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, a challenge that continues at the present day. Yeah.
So, you describe how Christianity once profoundly shaped Ireland's culture, politics, and national identity. I suppose, rather than going into the Reformation and all that, because we could probably do a section on each chapter, what do you think was the thing that propelled the Irish Christianity in both Northern Ireland and the Republic to unravel?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer because you've got to adjudicate the extent to which there's a single culture that crosses across the border. Yes. Or whether you've got two individual cultures on each side of the border. Mm-hmm. That's quite difficult, I think, to do. I think, so that's a caveat. In general terms, in the 1980s, in 1978, Pope John Paul II comes to the Republic, and of course a third of the country, something like that, turns out to see him.
Yeah, massive.
So it's just an extraordinary moment in the history of this island. And I think a moment that really speaks to the power and significance of Christendom in that sense. In the 1980s, things begin to change, and you get, I think, crucially, the Southern government opening up availability of contraception.
Okay.
And I think what that does is that it allows faithful Catholic families, couples, to begin to make decisions privately about a very important aspect of family life, which doesn't need to be articulated publicly, but which gives them a private space of independent action. And I've a hunch that that's actually a much more significant episode than we might have given credit for. So, of course, roughly similar time, there's a divorce referendum. There's other kinds of legal and political action that are taking place, and then, of course, in the 1990s, you begin to get the unravelling of this. You have, on the one hand, the decriminalisation of homosexual activity. On the other hand, you've also got the beginnings of news about scandals, clerical scandals, the Bishop of Galway, other quite high-profile cases, which, initially in the 1990s seem eccentric, perhaps even in some contexts amusing, but as the decade goes on, it becomes increasingly horrific, and generates revulsion. So I think that there's a massive, that the clerical scandals obviously create a massive problem for the Catholic Church in the Republic. In the North, it's more difficult, I think, to see when things begin to change. I think it might also be at the end of the 1990s, but I think that might have something to do with the peace process, ironically, that it's possible, I think, to argue that the Troubles actually held religious communities together, but that once they didn't need to sort of bunker up together, once they could begin to explore the world with a bit less danger, the religious identity became less significant to them. And as the identity became less significant, so patterns of church attendance, mass attendance also begin to change. And so they may have slightly different starting points in the 80s or 90s, but I think that's the 20-year period when we do begin to see things change quite quickly.
Do you think it may be something else as well, Crawford, is that you also have a lot of funding coming in 97, a reworking of the systems that then sort of steers people more secular, as well. So the school system is, is being, and everything is now being looked through the lens of equality rather than just, faith.
It's possible. It's not something I've really thought about. Yeah, but
okay. Okay. Well, so Ireland. This is the situation that we're in. So you refer to Ireland as emerging a post-Catholic. The Republic of Ireland is a post-Catholic identity, and I suppose Northern Ireland, you could say, well, actually, it's post-Protestant identity, because now we have a majority Catholic country. So how does that compare with the Protestant decline and the Christian decline in places like Scotland or Germany?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, in a place like Scotland, you can trace decline quite precisely. That it begins around 1963.
Okay.
Callum Brown at University of Glasgow has written a lot about this, patterns of secularisation, in a book called The Death of Christian Britain. And he can see quite clearly that really from the 1960s, mid-1960s onwards, everything begins to change in terms of church attendance. Church attendance peaks everywhere in the Western world after World War II. The 1950s and early 1960s are two of the most religious decades. That's the decade in America where "In God We Trust" goes in the coinage, where the Pledge of Allegiance begins to include one nation under God, that type of language. So a lot of this is brought in the 1950s. Of course, it's also the decade in which Billy Graham is doing his big arena crusades and so forth. We might talk about that later on. But an immediately post-Protestant nation looks slightly different perhaps than an immediately post-Catholic nation, but go forward a generation and they both probably look much alike, because they're still being driven by external forces. It's just no longer the church that's speaking those big grand narratives. Now it's media, typically American media, but not exclusively American media. And of course, if the problem in the influence of the church was too few people having too big an influence, that problem is compounded in the mediatized age when you've really a handful of people exercising extraordinary cultural influence because they have access to so many channels of broadcasting it.
Mm-hmm. Well, in what role do the evangelical and Reformed churches have in this new landscape? So we're maybe moving on to the future. So sort of look briefly at how we've got here. What role do evangelical and Reformed churches have in this new landscape then?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think evangelical and Reformed churches in Northern Ireland have been comfortable in a position of dominance. They've been comfortable when they thought the culture was broadly the culture that they had shaped, or a culture that they owned. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, I think that's not the case, if it ever was, but it probably isn't now. And as that realisation, I think, becomes more obvious to them, I think it is producing some heart searching. So if you rewind back to the 1990s, there was an organisation called ECONI, Evangelical Contribution of Northern Ireland, which really saw itself very explicitly as an Anabaptist type organisation. I think it was probably one of the very few organisations that would have adopted that kind of mentality at that time. But I think if you fast forward 30 years to 2020s, pretty much everyone's an Anabaptist now. They might not use the language, but the way they think about their relation to the state has, I think, moved very much in that direction. Maybe we can see, maybe one of the ways that we can see that is the declining number of clergy people becoming elected politicians.
Can I ask what do you mean by Anabaptist in that? Now, I know what historically it meant. What do you mean they're becoming more Anabaptist before we just go down that road?
Well, Anabaptist not in the sense of their views on baptism, because obviously lots of them are still practicing the baptism of infants. Presbyterian churches, Church of Ireland and so on. I mean Anabaptist in the sense that they no longer believe the state belongs to them. They may not believe that they belong to the state in a funny kind of way, but they're certainly separating the two, and seeing themselves as outside of something. But certainly the idea of the parish, I think, is giving way to the idea of the church's gathered congregation. Mm-hmm. And once you make that move, once you're accepting that your spiritual community is that person and that person, but not all of those people in the area where you live, I think you've changed your relationship to that area, spiritually speaking, and that you're operating now in a gathered church model, which is typically conceived of as an Anabaptist model. Yeah.
And we can't then influence the world, we just focus on our own personal walk and our own church. So, so your relationship with God is everything. Everything is between you and God. Mm-hmm. It might even go beyond your suggestion there, Nathan, to say that actually the church becomes less significant because it's so hyper-individualised, that everything becomes a matter between you and God. And so that then has significant impacts upon the development of any consensus around basic matters of Christian ethics or morality, for example. Okay. So, that being the case, where does that leave? If that continues, that trajectory continues, right, for another generation, where could that leave the church?
At its worst, it's impossible to predict. There's a narcissistic element to that at times. You can trace that actually through the lyrics of worship songs over the last 20 or 30 years, where increasingly the songs are about the experience of worship itself, rather than anything objective, any objective statements being made. I know there are pushbacks against that. The trend to recover hymnody, for example, is a very encouraging sign, I think, in many evangelical churches today. But yeah, I mean, what you could be left with 30 years from now is a kind of a warmed over revivalism, with lots of American influenced praise and worship music, people having a wonderful spiritual experience with their hand-picked brand of church on Sunday mornings, and maybe not making much of anything else, because it doesn't really matter. What really matters is what you do with the other people you worship with on a Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, could this decline in cultural Christianity, you said about the Anabaptists, decided where it could go, could this decline in cultural Christianity actually create space for a more authentic, convictional Christianity that's less dependent on social or political power?
Yeah, I think that's essentially what is happening, or what must happen, is that Christians need to begin to think about what the relationship is to the world around them. Christians are not simply able anymore to take for granted the support of the state, or even the support of the culture that the state is a reflection of. So there has to be a new way of thinking, really, about everything. But I mean, that is the call. That is the impulse within Protestantism, anyway. It is always to rethink, to go back to basics, to ask the big searching questions from first principles. And this is as good an opportunity as any, and probably better than most, for people to do that. And once you go back to the New Testament, you do begin to look at a very different world, where churches existed in a very different way, where worship looked quite different, where Christian life was pursued in a very different context, but with very different goals, I think, from today as well, and where Christ-likeness is everything. And my sense is that that's, again, something that we have forgotten, especially in the very busy, noisy, energetic world of social media, where opinion making is so important, that actually it's the hidden virtues of loving the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind and strength, loving your neighbour as yourself, do everything you do in the name of love, Paul says in 1 Corinthians. These are the things that must shape Christianity. So, do you see any signs of renewal or revival, and or do you anticipate continued decline? We've heard about this. I think whenever the book was written, this maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. Things were fairly downward trend, but there's now this sign of a new, they call it the quiet revival. Yeah. Do you see any signs of that, or do you think the trajectory is still tilted to secularism? Well, the quiet revival thing is kind of hot off the press, isn't it? Yeah. But I think there are signs of an unusual spiritual interest, actually, in the teenage people that I know. Mm-hmm. And that manifests itself in some really interesting and surprising ways. Yeah. So I don't know, I'm not going to say too much about that, except to say that's good, and I hope and pray that continues. Mm-hmm. But it's continuing in a downward trajectory. Yeah. So the overall tendency, I think, is towards decline or diminution or change. And I've said before, the church is always changing, and it will keep on changing. Unfortunately, now I think for the worse, by and large. Mm-hmm. But I think the general culture of the church can decline even as there are these shoots of renewal or hope that sprout up within it. There's lots of passages in Isaiah point to exactly that, a root from the stump of Jesse. Yes. Or a branch, I should say, from the stump of Jesse, and I think that's exactly what we can see. It's a stump, that's all. The life is gone. There's no more tree, but there's these little shoots that sprout up and give us some hope. We're going back maybe to our roots then. The Irish Church is maybe going back to 431, 431 or 432 when Patrick's supposed to arrive. Well, the problem with going back to 432 is it's 400 years too late. You need to go back to 32.
332.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, let's start with Jesus rather than start with Patrick.
Yeah.
But
there could be an argument for that.
Well, there would be. There is. When we sort of talk about the church in the past, though, and we're sort of we'll maybe segue into. We'll use this as a segue also into how certain churches have and thinkers have looked at secularism in America. But is there an argument to say that Irish Christianity, and I'm not saying we go back to monasticism, but there are certain things from monasticism that we could draw from. So the way in which monks, for instance, in the past would have set up monasteries, Columba, he sets up Iona, he puts in place a church, he puts in place a university, a hospital, and an economy grows around that, and then they use that to sort of plant other monasteries or communities, let's say. Do you think that is maybe one solution to this problem?
Yeah, it could be. I don't know quite where you go to plant your monastery these days, unfortunately.
Need a planning application.
But yeah, you would. There's a very nice radio house up on the north coast which was for sale for £100,000, one of the old Lloyd's ones.
There you go.
On a cliff edge. I thought that'd be a magic little monastery.
So all we need is 99,999.
Something like that. But those monks were extraordinary men. I mean, Columba, in addition to setting up monasteries, getting involved in production of books and literature, preserving knowledge, teaching, we might not call it exactly a university, but people were coming from all across Europe to study in those Irish institutions. The Irish institutions really had a global a European reputation for their learning. You can go out to the Aran Islands in Ishowen, and you can come across the old church there, and you'll see a 9th century grave for the 3 Romans. So these are 3 guys from Rome who went to the Aran Islands in the 9th century to study the Bible. And not only are they doing this, they're also really involved in missions. They're not hunkering down and huddling together. They're jumping in these little curras, these leather wicker boats covered in leather, jumping into the Atlantic. And we can trace the influence of Iona right the way up through the Western Isles into Orkney and Shetland, because you can actually see inscriptions of a certain type of cruciform, is that what it would be? Mm-hmm. That's distinctive to Iona before the 9th century, right the way up to Shetland. But more than that, it was Columban monks were the first human settlers on the Faroe Islands. They were also the first human settlers on Iceland. And we know that because archaeologists have discovered in one of the islands off the south of Iceland a number of caves in which the distinctive form of the Iona cross was being made. And that's a form that was dropped out of that community before the end of the 9th century. Mm-hmm. So, 100 years before the Vikings ever arrived on Iceland, Irish monks were there. What are they doing there? Well, maybe they're anchorites, maybe they just want to be left alone. Some of them did, but also some of them were like Columba, who were looking to bring the gospel to people, to see them converted and come to understand the Christian faith and trust in Jesus Christ. So they're driven by this missionary enterprise. So all of that's going on. But they're also paying attention to the world of politics and government. Yeah. Because Columba takes part in the 560s, I think. It's 567. He takes part in the first Christian coronation of any king on these islands, which is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. So they're thinking of themselves individually. They're thinking of themselves as part of the church. They're thinking of themselves in the responsibility for evangelism and mission. They're also thinking of themselves in terms of the world, the culture around them, and how they want to see that fashioned and brought into submission to the claims of the King of Kings.
Okay, so and we have to appreciate as well the world in which they are growing in. It's very turbulent time, much more turbulent than ours. Rome has collapsed. There's the volcano, the worst year in the world. That's apparently
right. 536,
and they have. You've had devastation, famines, and all so forth. So all of this has happened, and yet they're not retreating in a holy huddle, as you say. They're going out.
But I think what makes this really interesting is, I mentioned before, when Patrick rewrites the Second Nicene Creed, he adds that section that Jesus is coming back really soon.
Okay.
And he knows that because the gospel has reached the end of the world, geographically and temporally, right? So that's 430s, 440s, 450s. The year 536, what happens? 3 volcanoes go off, we don't quite know where. We do know that they throw up hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tons of debris into the atmosphere. Yeah. There's a sudden global cooling. The scientists reckon it's the fastest cooling for 2,000 years.
Yes.
The sun goes dark. There's no harvest for 3 years. Mm-hmm. So what happens when the sun goes dark? You believe you're at the end of the world. All of a sudden, you're seeing exactly the signs that Jesus talks about. Mm-hmm. So what do? Go and try and convert people. So they're thinking that everything is ending, mm-hmm. and it really is. But their impulse is not to say, I need to write a bestseller and connect this to the headlines. Their impulse is to say, we need to go. It's a good time to go. We need to jump in a little coracle boat covered in leather and just see if we can find some island somewhere out in the Atlantic we've never seen before.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is at that time, it seems that if you look across the whole world, I think 20 different records, including the Irish records, yep. They mention it's dark or it's famine or cold or yep. So definitely something crazy did happen then.
And that's also the year in which Scandinavian agricultural collapses.
Yes.
And all those lovely Scandinavian farmers decide they've got to form a new economy.
Yes. And
those 3 years of cold from 536 to 5340 or thereabouts are the years that give the Scandinavians their idea of Fimbulwinter. Okay. This period of 3 years of darkness and cold that precedes Ragnarok, the War of the Gods.
Okay, wow. And it's also, as well, the Justinian, he decided... The plague comes after that.
That's right.
And then any chance of a restored Roman Empire falls by the wayside at that point. So we're seeing it's a point of great change.
Yep. And
arguably there are parallels with our own age. Thankfully there's been no volcanoes, although you never know. So we'll look at then Ireland. We'll just look briefly at your book there, To America. So both Ireland and the US are undergoing secularization, but in different ways. In your book, Evangelical Resistance in America, you explore how Christians have responded to cultural decline. And one of the key points in that was the 1925 Scopes trial was seen as the turning point. How did that event shape public perception of evangelicalism, or even within evangelicalism?
Yeah, the Scopes trial in 1925 was a trial about whether it's permissible to teach evolutionary science in schools or not in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And it becomes this kind of national focus. Mm-hmm. It's broadcast live on radio. Lots of big name journalists go down and have a great time reporting on these kind of rural, southern religious fundamentalists. Yeah. Who seem opposed to any kind of idea of progress or scientific knowledge. And that's very much how the Scopes trial is represented. The religious conservatives win the trial, but they lose they lose the public
propaganda war.
Yeah, exactly. And so they do retreat into holy huddles really for 20, 30 years until the 1950s. And really it's in the 1950s that evangelicals begin to move out of that and back into the public sphere. Mm-hmm. With a little bit more self-confidence to try to make some kind of public impact. But during that 20 or 30 year period after the Scopes trial, evangelicals are setting up their own media, most famously Christianity Today.
Yes.
They're setting up lots and lots of Bible colleges.
Bob Jones University.
Yeah. And many more besides.
Liberty,
yeah. But they're also moving away from that perception that they are southern and rural. Mm-hmm. So it's very significant, for example, in the 1950s when the Billy Graham operation really begins, that he's based in Chicago. And while there may be some kind of family links to the South, as there were for him, it's a northern, urban, youth-focused, energetic, enterprising, entrepreneurial, revivalistic culture that he's really trying to promote. And of course, he's promoting that in the 1950s, which, as I said before, is the decade after the war, when all of these guys are demobbed, when culture is really moving to support Christian assumptions about basically everything. And in the United States, that's when In God We Trust gets in coins. It's when the Pledge of Allegiance begins to incorporate the reference to nation under God and so forth. So it's a moment of real belligerence, real confidence for evangelicals, because the whole culture is moving with them. They're being pushed as much as they're leading a cultural trend.
Then, I suppose, you outline 3 broad strategies of evangelical response to cultural decline. Now, I mean, in terms of response to it, so to combat it, what is revivalism? And I suppose arguably Billy Graham, but I suppose we see it more in the sort of revivalistic prayer meetings and different things like that. The second is the religious right. We see that Jerry Falwell, and the alignment of faith and conservative politics. And then the third one is Reconstructionism, a theologically grounded movement led by thinkers like R.J. Rushdoony and Gary North. So could you walk us through briefly each one of those models?
Yeah, so I mentioned Billy Graham before, 1950s, and that really is a period when the culture is behind the church and supporting the church and its claims, and when very few people would stand up in the public sphere and say, I'm an atheist, or I don't accept Christian morality in its most basic way. So in that context, you can really focus on the individual, reviving the individual, or perhaps reviving the local church, the local congregation. In the 1980s, things are changing. You move from a broadly supportive culture to a neutral culture. And in the 1980s, then, evangelicals are beginning to strategize to think, we don't just need to pray for ourselves individually or ourselves as a group in our congregation or the church generally. We also need to think about politics and society. So what are we going to do with that? So the schools are still on our side. Maybe to some extent the media is still on our side. But we need to think about politics, and so we need to form these big broad-based coalitions to look for lowest common denominators with other religious conservatives to begin to try to create the state in our image. And so the 1980s, early 1990s, I guess, the impulse for the religious right is to try to get our man into the White House. And once we get our man in the White House, then we are able to get policy to create the world that we want to see. But then the culture keeps changing. And it moves from being broadly positive to neutral, and then from being neutral to being negative towards Christianity. And so the third model really of state, Christian-state relationship, comes into play. And that's a much more ambitious project, because it recognises how much Christians have lost, which is to say, broadly speaking, everything. And what that means is that Christian responsibility has to expand to include, broadly speaking, everything. So the impulse to education means that you can't just build Bible colleges as you did when the culture was broadly on your side. You've got to think about basic primary school education, secondary school education, and not just Bible colleges, but liberal arts colleges, music conservatories, schools of law. Everything has to be recreated from scratch. And so the principles of Christian Reconstruction are really begin to be articulated in the 60s by R.J. Rushdoony. He gathers a small number of people around him, which begins to create an outsized influence in an institute that he sets up called the Chalcedon Institute in California. And they publish a lot, do a lot of conferences, do a lot of speaking. Rushdoony is significant in the history of homeschooling in America because he's brought in as an expert witness in so many of the state trials that would lead to the legalization of homeschooling throughout the 50 states. So that's although although the principles are laid out in the 1960s, it's really only in the post-2010 period, 50 years later, that they begin to get really significant cultural purchase. But they do that not through Reconstructionists per se, but through people who are like 0.5 Reconstructionists, people like Douglas Wilson in Idaho, and the group of people that has gathered around his ministry and the ministry of fellow travellers in that location.
What do you think is the difference? What's the difference between 1.0 and 2.0, or
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What makes Rushdoony different? Personally, I think he might be less appealing than some of the more media savvy, often quite witty exponents of this now. Rushdoony was a very formidable intellectual. He had, I think it's fair to say, some biographical work on Rushdoony has suggested he was a Holocaust denier. There's a lot of concern, I think, about some aspects of his thinking or publications, published work. The new 0.5 Reconstructionists, maybe a little bit less formidably intellectual, but more culturally open. And so they're engaged in art, in music, in creative writing and fiction. They are setting up more enduring and more enduringly successful institutions. For example, a liberal arts college in Moscow, Idaho. And so they are also setting up denominations. So the work of this group is less based around a single individual and more collective in its bringing together different types of voices, different locations. And so that, I think, has grown quite significantly over the last, I think, 15 years in particular. It took a long time to get it going, from the 80s until about maybe 2005, 2010, but I think after that period it has really accelerated its growth.
So, in one sense, marketing, then, it's marketed better, and it's also better supported, and maybe a bit more, as you say, savvy.
It's maybe more clearly articulated, certainly more simply articulated. The ideas are in many respects very similar. Yeah. In that, excuse me, while the religious right wanted to achieve change from the top down, Rushdoony and the Idaho 0.5 Reconstructionists want to see change from the individual up. So it's from the ground up. So Rushdoony wasn't always a very careful theologian, quite apart from his views in history. And for example, he says things about the law, for example, the divine law, which could not be supported by the New Testament in terms of the law's role in sanctification. So he's quite a blunt instrument in some ways. As I say, the allegation of Holocaust denial is in the air. But in the 1960s, he's also a very prescient thinker about where culture is going to go, because he sees this bifurcation between different ways of thinking about the world. And he suggests in the 1960s and 70s that the tendency of people to think about their place in the world is always towards rationalisation and simplification. So people will move away from cognitive dissonance to try to make their world the way they think it ought to be. And so I think he anticipated that there would be a growing cleavage between people who are committed to a Christian way of thinking about the world and people who are not, because the first principles are different. That would inexorably work out towards two radically different ways of thinking about reality.
Yeah. And Rushdoony is an Armenian who was, I think, certainly the descendant of people who were involved in the massacre. His parents were certainly involved. They were Armenians who were being persecuted by the Turks. So the fact that he is sort of from that perspective of a Christian minority, he understands this a bit better than somebody who's in 1960s America, who's used to America is Christian.
So I think Rushdoony, his parents move initially to Edinburgh for his father's studies, becomes a minister in the Church of Scotland. Interestingly enough, Rushdoony then makes it to the States, the family makes it to the States, he too becomes a Presbyterian minister, initially in the mainstream Presbyterian church in the US.
Yes.
So their inclinations as a family are initially towards the mainstream, which is a really interesting part of the story. But then as he becomes aware of the state, because he goes out to Idaho as a missionary to Native American peoples, and he becomes very aware of the ways in which the state is weakening the people he's trying to strengthen.
Yeah.
The state is attacking Native American culture. And it's a very interesting origin point of his story, because he sees all this happen. There's some personal difficulties in his family as well, quite significant. But he sees all of this happen outside the church, and actually it pushes him then to abandon mainstream Presbyterianism to become a minister of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which at that point is a very small, I suppose quite pietistic body, which he becomes increasingly uncomfortable in, because he sees it's really not thinking about its responsibilities towards the wider world. Yeah,
and it's not saying, and certainly not reacting to the needs, of the people that he's ministering to. Yeah. Then I suppose, why has homeschooling become such a powerful tool for evangelical resistance?
Well, there are about 3 million young people being homeschooled in the United States that we know of at the moment. In the United Kingdom, it's impossible to know exactly, because there's no requirement to register your child. But we do know that before COVID, it was in the region of 100,000 young people were being home educated. Post-COVID, that's almost certainly a much higher number, but we don't know what it would be. Homeschooling is attractive not just to evangelicals, but to anybody who wants to see their child formed in their way of understanding what the world is and what the world's all about. Evangelicals are interested in homeschooling because it allows them to make sure their child is being educated with values and information that schools are not likely to provide. And it also allows them to protect their children from influences that they may find unhelpful in their child's spiritual formation. So, I mean, the great thing about homeschooling is you can do what you like. The really bad thing about homeschooling is you can do what you like. So, obviously, there's horror stories attached to it, but there's also some great examples of success. So, homeschooling, I mean, if we think about it more in terms of Christian education, whether that's provided in Christian schools or in a Christian homeschool, there's very few Christian homeschoolers who are absolutely isolated anyway. Most of them are involved in some kind of co-op that I can see. But yeah, it provides a way of educating your child according to first principles of the Christian faith in a way that's consistent with that. So, a Christian family, in addition to worshipping together every day, reading the Bible together, praying together, catechizing their children, singing together, in addition to going to church every Sunday and hopefully during the week as well as that's opportune. Homeschooling allows them to, if you like, capture so much of the rest of the day, so that they're not sending their children off to be indoctrinated, as they might see it, in an institution that's sometimes fundamentally hostile to what they believe.
Yeah. And so, why do you think that was in America? Because like here we have, so say maybe they think maybe 1,000. They don't know exactly kids, but in America we're talking about 2 million kids and growing, and the homeschooling movement is growing really rapidly. Why do you think America has captured the vision on this one?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think 3 million is the stat I have for the US, 100,000 for the UK plus. Why in America? I don't really know. I suppose it's maybe to do something with American education. Something also to do with American character. The Americans, by and large, are a bit more open to risk than people here. Perhaps also American attitudes to the state, to expectations of a small state, means there's a bit more of a do-it-yourself culture and people are prepared to take those kinds of risks. I think over here, as I say, in Northern Ireland at least, Christians have tended, Protestant Christians, evangelical Christians have tended to think the state is behind them or broadly supportive of them, so the schools still belong to them. I think that will change. That is changing. That will change. I think there are signs that denominations that were once quite hostile to homeschooling now have a number of homeschoolers among them. Mm-hmm. And that's always a curious thing to see.
Yeah. Well, you'd said that earlier that there was the whole top-down approach of the religious right, and we got to be real and say that in some ways we still see its influence today with Trump and also in the Trump administration and so forth. But they got their man into the White House in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, and they had great hopes. The Christian right had great hopes that he was going to deliver a reformation. Yet he comes in and he brings in no-fault divorce, brings in amnesty for a lot of immigrants, and brings in a whole rake of other issues that the religious right are not happy with, and it's seen as a revolution that doesn't really work. So is this part of the reason why 0.5 Reconstructionism is also gains a bit of traction? There's a recognition that maybe there's something wrong in politics.
Yeah, so back in the 1990s, the folks in Idaho would have had maybe a slightly different view of politics than they have today. Mm-hmm. So back in the 90s, they would have been opposed to the religious right at a fundamental level. They produced a magazine called Credenda Agenda, very stimulating, often quite amusing magazine full of content that tried to develop their principal ideas. One of those issues was about politics. All of their issues were about politics, but one of them in particular was focused on it. And in one article, the author said, "I don't have a political agenda, I've got an agenda for politics." And there was a sense, I think a widely shared sense among the writers of that magazine, that Christians should simply begin to operate on the basis of their own convictions and not vote for the lesser of two evils, but just vote consistently, if you vote at all. I think that changed a little bit towards the end of the first Trump administration, because Trump, funnily enough, began to take an interest in them. Famously retweeted some material that showed members of that particular congregation being arrested during a COVID era hymn sing.
Yeah.
Turned out their arrest was illegal, and I think there was an apology issued several months later. But I think the Biden years have radicalised in some ways certain sections of this movement. The movement itself has begun to proliferate. It's become much more diverse, even politically diverse. There are people who were at one point influenced by this movement who've really begun to form movements of their own, some of which are pretty horrific, actually, to look at in terms of their views on race, particularly their anti-Semitism, which is really vicious at times, and that's terrible, horrible to see.
And to be fair, I think Doug has been calling that out as well.
Absolutely. So I think it's been very significant then to see people who might once have been unchallenged be resisted and respond to that very, very vigorously indeed, which is necessary and good. So why? So I've forgotten your question, Nathan.
Yeah, I suppose the idea was, what do you think that was the reason? The 90s and the failed revolution, as it were, in the Reagan era, and then of the religious right, did that empower zero Reconstructionism in Idaho 0.5 to sort of really pursue the project?
Yep. I think it's more to do with Trump than Reagan, for sure. I think of course, Jimmy Carter was an evangelical too.
Yes.
And it was under him that the abortion legislation was introduced. So, there's been a number of individuals who've been set up there with great expectations who have, if you like, underperformed according to certain themes in Christian ethics.
Okay. Well, we're coming close to the end here. So, in both Ireland and America, Christians are trying different ways to resist secularism. What path forward do you think is the most faithful to the text, I suppose, or traditional Christianity, and also the most effective?
Well, I think Jesus calls us to love the Lord our God with our heart, soul, mind and strength, and then to love our neighbours as ourselves. And if we could just start doing that, I think we'd make a bit more progress. So the temptation is to think, well, I need to set this up, or need to do this, or need to engage with this in terms of culture or politics. But actually, as Jesus reminds us, it's who we are inside that makes the difference. And, he gives us the Holy Spirit. So when he calls us to love, he gives us the Holy Spirit who produces love in us as one of his fruits. And, we begin to live as Christians individually. The church begins to live collectively as the church. That's the most powerful thing that we could possibly see. That is salt and light, isn't it?
Yeah. So what you're saying is focus on your self-government, then the church government, then the national government works out itself?
Well, someone I know said to me once, you preach the Bible and just see what happens. Okay. And I think there's something quite freeing about that. Yeah. Because I think it's really easy to sit and, sit in your armchair and think, well, here's my manifesto. Here's how everything's going to change. And that's dead easy because it's always something for somebody else to do. Yeah. Or it's an implausibly difficult project. I need to set up a new political party or, something like that. Maybe that's something you're going to do. Sorry, Nathan.
Oh, here.
But actually, to be a Christian is to follow Jesus Christ. Yeah. To be part of the church is to gather with other Christians on a Sunday. Baptism, Lord's Supper, preaching, prayer, singing. It's not difficult. Mm-hmm. But we do have a tendency to overcomplicate things. Yes.
So why has Reformed theology in particular played such a major role in shaping these resistance movements? I don't even like using the word resistance because it sounds like it's a freedom fighter thing, but ways to, in a sense, combat secularism. Why do you think Reformed theology in particular?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think you're right. Really, from the 16th century to the present day, the people who, and of course, we're not suggesting that Reformed people have all the answers or the only people who have had any answers. Far from it. But one of the strengths of Reformed theology, I think historically, has been that it's focused in the gospel, it's focused in Jesus Christ as prophet, priest and king. Mm-hmm. Really important to see who he is, what he has done, what he is doing, what he will do. Yeah. But also, not only is it focused in the gospel, on the key things that all Christians believe in, it also thinks about the implications of those claims for everything else. Mm-hmm. So it's God, but it's everything else in relation to God. Yeah. So that there is no possible aspect of what is outside of God, if you can use that kind of language, to which God and our talk about God does not apply. Mm-hmm. So poetry, music, politics, economics, shopkeeping, surfing, everything is to be done to God's glory. And as Martin Luther famously said, you can change a nappy to the glory of God. He may not have been a Calvinist, but once you get that kind of attitude that everything I do is dignified in the eyes of God because I do it to his glory, then everything opens up as a field for worship. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful.
So worship isn't just on a Sunday, it's every day. It's everything.
Obviously, what we do when we worship in church is distinct. Mm-hmm. We go there for the ordinances, the sacraments. We go there for fellowship. We go there to listen to the preaching of the word. from someone who's been given that gift. Yeah. There are distinctive things about that, but yeah, everything we do to God's glory, or we ought to.
It's a means of grace that we can, but at the same time, we can't do without Sunday morning. But if Sunday morning is all we have, it's a hollow Christianity.
It's where it starts.
Yeah,
it's not where it ends.
That's right. Well, look, Dr. Gribben, thank you so much for such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. As I said, if people want to read the book, you'll find out a bit more. I know you'd certainly be happy if people bought the book.
Yes, please don't get it from the library.
Don't get it second hand.
Actually, it's okay if you get it from the library, don't worry.
So, today we've journeyed through the early days of Irish Christianity, its cultural dominance and decline, and the accelerating secularism that now defines much of public life. We then looked at America, where we examined evangelical responses to modernity and cultural change. Briefly, we looked at revivalism and the religious right to the long-term strategy of Christian Reconstructionism. Thank you so much for coming here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks for the invitation.
So, before we finish, are there any upcoming projects or areas of research that you'd like to highlight for listeners, or maybe any weeks where you can go and hear you speak?
Well, with a couple of other guys, I've been involved in editing John Owen's unpublished sermons. There's about 70 of those. So that'll double the number of sermons by Owen that we have. So that's quite exciting. Hopefully that'll come out next year.
Very good. And, well, look, Dr. Gribben, thank you for joining us. And to all of our listeners, if you found this conversation helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, hit that bell, and share it with others who care about the future of the church in Ireland, in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and in America in this secular age. So until next time, keep advancing Christ's kingdom in every domain and moving forward with truth.